I'm Dr. Stacey Johnson. I am an Olympian in the sport of fencing, and I've served fencing for many years in a variety of capacities. I started off as an athlete advocate and served on the Athletes Council, eventually became an officer of USA Fencing. I was a vice president for a quad, and then I ultimately became president. I was helpful getting women's épée included on the Olympic program, and then I became a pretty pivotal person internationally to get women's saber for the 2004 Olympics in Athens. I also have been serving within the FIE, the International Federation for Fencing, for 9 years, being the inaugural chair of the Women in Fencing Council, which is really an advocacy group for the FIE to improve the condition for women in our sport. I also was an officer with the US Olympic Committee for the NGB Council and served on the executive committee. I am a 1980 Olympian, so that's been brought up recently because a lot of athletes have had similar feelings with the postponement of the Tokyo Olympics. As an athlete, I was just enraged that after all the work that you could do, that someone could pull the carpet out from underneath you. And I was very lucky that at that time, Dr. Anita DeFranz, who was a lawyer and an Olympic rower, was head of the Athletes Advisory Council. And she organized a number of athletes to speak against the boycott, although that was not the first time I had used athlete advocacy. Earlier in the 70s with apartheid, we were approached by South Africa to go, all expenses paid, but there was a caveat. On the national team at that time was Peter Westbrook and Nikki Franke. And a Dr. Richard Lapchak, who was leading a movement to get all Olympic athletes to boycott South Africa. And he came and spoke to us. And after he spoke with us, they gave the decision up to the athletes. And the athletes came together and basically said, not only are we not going to South Africa now for this World Cup, but we will never go to South Africa until apartheid is lifted. So that was really my first experience with athlete advocacy. And then later, the 1980 incident, and I became very knowledgeable about all the laws, all the rules, how the U.S. Olympic Committee was enacted by the federal government, what the meaning of that was. One of the things that Anita had made these pins up for us to wear that said, "We're here to make sure this never happens again." And I really took that to heart. And that was the beginning of saying, well, I'm going to get involved to change things so this doesn't happen to anybody else, because it was completely antithetical to the Olympic movement, which is, of course, based around the idea of setting down your arms and coming together peaceably. And of course, there was not a normalized Olympic Games for 8 more years because they boycotted us in '84. And it accomplished absolutely nothing. Carter has said that it was a mistake. I served as vice president under Steve Sobel, and he was really an incredible person and a fabulous mentor for me. He was also an officer in the U.S. Olympic Committee. There was another woman, but she did not serve for a full quadrennial. Her name was Emily Johnson. She was a judge, and she actually appointed Gay and I as the first women referees to the Fencing Officials Commission. She had so much trouble. The men didn't like her at all and were horrible. And so she was gone in less than 2 years. I'm the first woman to serve a full 4-year quadrennial. That was very scary because predominantly the people who were running U.S. fencing were all lawyers, all men. And as you very well know, it has changed somewhat now. And of course, the whole society is working to make changes now. It was very combative. You really had to know how to operate on your feet intellectually with arguments in the moment. There were other people who came to my aid. I had the most diverse executive team. After I did that service, I think more women were willing to step forward. And I'm proud to say that I was one of the very first people to help Peter Westbrook write grants and get grant money way back for the start of his foundation. Those are the reasons that you go into leadership, is to facilitate the pathway for others. Race and Bowden recently taking a knee, I think he is reflecting what is going on in the larger society. There is no question in my mind that the largest disruptors, and in my opinion very positively so, has been Black Lives Matter movement, Me Too movement, but also safe sport and the whole debacle with gymnastics, but it's also happened in swimming, and quite frankly is pervasive in all sports, which is why safe sport has come around. And I'm very proud to say that on the international level, that is one of the things that the Women in Fencing Council did, was to introduce and say, we must do this safe sport in the FIA, which, let me tell you, that has been a difficult road to travel. But then the IOC came along and said, yes, we are going to do this. But I think it's been really incredible that the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee now has formed a 44-member Team USA Council on Racial and Social Justice. It has 4 committees. One is the right to protest and demonstrations, and of course race is serving on that committee. Athlete voice and advocacy is another subcommittee. Institutional awareness and cultural change, and racism and acts of discrimination. USA Fencing is very well represented. We have 2 individuals on the Leadership Council, and we have representation on 2 of the 4 subcommittees. I think what Race did was really good, and I'm glad that the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee is coming to deal with it. I think it's really important that we get some change, but I see it already. All you got to do is go and look at the website on the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee, and you can see the data charts that they have put forward to measure the rate of success for bringing in people of color, differences with men and women, and also hiring people and setting up structures within the NGB itself. FIE's Women in Fencing Council came into existence was to make some level of movement into broadening the diversity within the FIE governance structure and into the FIE itself. The leader of the FIE is not an individual who is particularly supportive of women's leadership. The first meeting that I had as the chair of that council with all the other chairs of the commission, I walked in the door and he said to me, he says, well, women are very good at administrative duties, but they're not leaders. What I decided with the other members of the council was that the first thing that we needed to address was, could we increase the required percentage of representation into the governance structure for voting? The IOC, the International Olympic Committee, had made the mandate back in the 80s that 20% of all people in the governance structure had to be women. We know from data that the United Nations puts out that if you can get 30% of the governance structure with women, it's like the flywheel. They can get it moving. But under 30%, it's very difficult. But we have raised it up to 30% now. But it took me 8 years to make that level of progress against, quite frankly, an administration that did not want to see me succeed, nor the council succeed. So it was very, very difficult. My biggest contributions, I think, were with Women's Saber, because as I came in as president, I had a real strategic plan to strengthen the United States by trying to get as many people elected into the FIE governance structure as I possibly could. This was a fairly controversial thing. They would only cherry pick and nominate a few people. And I said, I don't think that's the way to do it. I think the way to do it is to have an American sit on every commission and council. And that way we have communications wired. and can subtly help and know what's happening in the playing field on a much larger scale. Behind that thought was, what were the key legislative things I wanted to get done? And bringing women's saber into the Olympic program was one of those. First step is to have that ready, because you take office right after the Olympic Games, and then in November is the elective Congress. So you have a very short window to turn this around. So I had done a lot of work before I came president to get all this ready. And then when we came in, we got an American on every commission and council, and it was unbelievable. Then I said, okay, now we can start to work on the legislation. I wrote a grant to the US Olympic Committee at that time to get some additional funding to support a campaign to bring women's saber. And I also made common cause with the Pan American Confederation, which had not been done. And we worked to get them elected into the Congress. So we said, we'll help you get elected, you help us get elected, and then help us to move this policy issue, which they did. It's a very close vote. Ultimately, it was only like 7 votes difference, but we prevailed. I was physically threatened twice. I had letters that were sent out, for example, from Hungary that said, well, women's saber, they're too immature, they're not ready to handle saber. And so I would have to write letters that would refute that, and I sent it out to everybody. And so it was quite a battle. Saber, because of its historical development, was predominantly came out of the military, and the military men who were officers, because they rode on horseback. In the FIE, if you looked around, the people who were in leadership were men who were saber fencers. And they held themselves above. The French president at the time of the FIE, René Roch, was enlightened a little bit. And he was supporting this. And so without the support of him, also, it never would have happened. To get on the Olympic program, they hold a World Championships, but the big thing is the Olympic Games. And of course, the other thing that I really had to fight was U.S. coaches and athletes, because what we had to give up was, for a period of time, is they had to rotate out weapons that would lose a set of medals to enable women's saber to come in. And so the first ones that were going to be punished was women foilists. So the women foilists hated me because I harmed them, but I was playing the long game. And I'll never forget, I was in Athens up in the stands when Mariel won and Seda took third. And Bucky Leach, the women's coach at that time for foil, came up to me and he said, "You're right. You did the right thing." Really, what happened at those games is, because the women won, it broke the psychology of the U.S. never getting a win. It had been 100 years since women had won anything, and it had been, Peter Westbrook was alone in the forest for forever. Then you started to see other weapons starting to do well. In 1982, I was at the Olympic Festival. I was competing. I tore my ACL. I had really the best surgeons and all of that. And I came back, and I was like the first alternate for 84. But in that final, I tore my hamstring. So I had rehabbed from 82 for the knee, and then I tore my hamstring. It was time for me, and it was time for me professionally. I knew that higher education was going to be my path. I needed to get going in that area. It was definitively the right decision for me, but yet I stayed very involved for many years to come through my administrative service. I followed the path of sport, and it informed my work in higher education, and higher education informed my work in sport. At the college that I was last at in Orlando, the other 2 presidents were athletes. One had been a college volleyball player, and the other one was like an incredible scratch golfer. And we had so much in common because of sport. Even though we played different sports, we got it with each other. We got being teammates to each other. We really cared about each other. And so I think that comes out of that experience of being athletes. Yeah, we were on a different playing field, but we trusted each other. And I think that's what you do with teammates, right? You've watched how your teammate performs and operates. And that's, of course, what made the team of Gay Vinny and I so strong, is that we trusted each other, we loved each other, we understood each other, and we filled in and knew when somebody needed something, to help them to make that next touch. There is no question that women competing at the Olympic Games in all sports have almost achieved parity, okay? In Rio de Janeiro, I believe there was 5,000 women competing in 300 different events, which represents 45% of all the participants. So we're incredibly close to coming to a full 50%. But where women are absent and where it's so important is completely throughout the governance structures and completely in the coaching structures and also in the media power structures. And without women coming into those arenas, you are going to continue to fight issues of pay equity, fair media coverage, even things to this day, believe it or not. I tell a story in the 1970s when it would rain at my high school. The girls would have to go downstairs and play jacks, and the guys got the gym. And even today, women still often can be found to have the lesser of the performance spaces, the lesser of the equipment, etc., especially in other countries. And women have come to the Women in Fencing Council to try internationally to get help. We had a woman, their country's governing body, like the US Olympic Committee, taking her money that she had individually garnered from the IOC for scholarship purposes. If there's going to be thieving, it also will go and hurt women, because we do not have the strength and power in the governance. We have come a long way in equity for participation, and a big part of that is Title IX. Once the US has done that, then they cause that to happen in other countries, which is exactly what has happened in safe sport. Once that started to happen in US, Canada, Great Britain, it forces that then into the system, and then the IOC makes the rules, says then you can't compete without that. But it's a long journey to get there. I think it's very important to look at those two things separately and understand the importance of both, and why it's really important to have women in coaching, women referees, women at the direct art technique, and most importantly in leadership, that are good leaders, help to make changes that are good for everybody. Not just women, but for everybody. Kind of a spiritual standpoint, when those young ladies won those medals, for me, it was the completion of the circle, and allowed me, I think, to really, at a very deep level, let go of 1980. Because what was most important is that I help the next generation and help the country.